DESIREÉ Martinez, you are president of Cogstone Resource Management, a company that has specialized for 20 years this April in paleontology, archaeology, and heritage protection and emergency management. And you are also a Tongva community member. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation from the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies for our OPED and podcast series on the intersections between current events and our research and the state of our fields. Over the next couple of months, we will be focusing on the Americas and the effects of colonization. In my recent podcast interview with Wendy Teeter, Senior Curator of Fowler Museum, we talked about how early colonial narratives have shaped the perceptions of Indigenous history, bringing about the erasure of Indigenous innovation in particular and history in general. In our conversation, as you and I prepared for the podcast, you talked about the double narratives and identities that the Indigenous peoples have had to construct, kinds of crypto identities that they have inhabited and adopted for many generations. So I'm hoping that today you could share with us some examples of these double narratives and also of survival tactics from your experience as a Tongva community member.
Yes. So a lot of what I like to talk about, particularly when we're looking at Tongva community history, particularly in the Los Angeles County area and within our traditional territories, is a lot of people don't realize that the Gabrielino Tongva still exist, that they're the original people of the land and caretakers of the land still live among them. And a lot of that has to do with the erasure of Indigenous history in general, but also because of our own history, particularly the diaspora of our communities, because of the effects of missionization on our communities. And so when the Spanish started to settle Alta California, they established a number of missions up and down the coast of California, and one of them being in San Gabriel, California, which is the mission that was in the heart of Gabrielino territory. And so for people that may not know, for those tribes that were associated with a particular mission, those people were named by that mission. So the mission name of our community is Gabrielino, and we use Tongva as the name of our community now so that we can strip the shackles of that colonial name. And so one of the things that the missions were really good at and tried to do was to make sure that the Indigenous people who came into the mission became basically peasants, the peasantry of what was the typical Spanish civilization over in Spain, where we were the workers, the laborers, in order to tend to the crops, the animals, the ranches that produce the food to not only feed the missions, but also the soldiers and the settlers that were coming into California. And with that integration into the mission system also came the silencing or attempt at silencing our cultural traditions. Being a Spanish peasant also meant being Catholic and taking on those Catholicism religious practices. But a lot of what the story that was told or has been told previously is that we willingly went into the missions and we were happy little people there. And if it wasn't for the missions and the missionaries teaching us how to farm and how to, husband animals, we would have died of starvation. And that was been the history for a long time. And in some instances, in order to survive, the Gabrielino Tongva community members took on that identity as Spanish Catholic peasant in order to continue to live. Because if once the mission knew that you were Indian, they would bring you into the mission system. Once the mission system became secularized in 1834, and our community members were released out into the world, and particularly when America became the owners of California in 1850, to recognize yourself as Indian was detrimental to yourself. There were bounties on Indian heads and scalps to get rid of the Indian problem, because Native American communities all up and down California were causing issues for Anglo-American settlement. And so a lot of Tongva community members continued to take on and use Spanish names, actually speak Spanish because that was what was being taught in the missions, as well as practice Catholic rituals and rites. But in the dark, in their houses, away from the public eye, we were still continuing our cultural practices, our songs, our ceremonies. So during the day, we're Spanish, or what ended up being, understood as also Mexican as well when Mexico took over from the Spanish, and then the Americans took over. We're Spanish speaking, Mexican peasants. But it's a way of surviving. If you raised your hand and said, I'm Indian, they wanted to get rid of you. And so that's one of the largest struggles that, we're continuing to do, is to say we took on this identity to survive. We are now stripping off this outside identity to shine through the identity we were always practicing through history.
Desiree Martinez, I really want to thank you for having shared this with us, this multi-generational long experience, and you did it in such a powerful way. And what I'm realizing at this very moment is what I think I heard you say, is that if we are hearing so clearly, finally now, the Indigenous voices, it is because they have been silenced. They were silenced by others, but they were also silenced by the very members of the community. And they had to do that. They had to, in order to survive, adopt these tactics. But now, finally, we can hear these voices. Of course, what you've also shared with us is the long and slow ways of coming to that consciousness. So thank you again. I want to continue on this exploration with you of the personal and the professional, and the ways in which they intersect. You are, as I said, the president of a cultural resources management company, and these layers of systemic erasure definitely call for an archaeology, whether that work is of a material or immaterial heritage. And so as president of this company, Cogstone, you come across many examples of the unintended consequences that persist to this day as effects of early colonial narratives. And certainly one of them is that the indigenous communities have been separated from their own history. And this is what you had shared with us, the ways in which one is cut off from it through silence. But there are ways in which history and law also intersect in rather troubling ways, and that they have proven very resistant to change, ways in which material and immaterial come into conflict, and that you've experienced as the head of your company. I was hoping you could share that with us as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I can share a story that I was involved in when I was just a regular archaeologist that I came across, and particularly when the Plaza de Cultura y Artes, which is a museum institution that was created in 2010, 11, in order to celebrate the contributions of Spanish and Mexican peoples to the development of Los Angeles. And it was a museum that had been in the works for over 20 years and spearheaded by a lot of prominent local Latino citizens and representatives. And when they started to build this museum, in particular a memorial garden, the museum is right next to La Placita, which is the first Catholic church that was established in Los Angeles. And next to La Placita was the cemetery. And it was actually people that were buried on both sides as well as in front of the church as well. And so when La Plaza started to dig to create this memorial garden, they hit burials. And so our community, the Tongva community, as well as the local archaeological community, became aware of this because a student that was working on that project was a whistleblower. And so this cemetery was established in 1822 and people were buried there up until 1844. And so usually what ends up happening under the California Environmental Quality Act is that there is an environmental review to make sure that your project is not going to impact environmental resources. And that's what my company does, is we do these analyses. And so another cultural resources firm was hired by Los Angeles County for the La Plaza project to review to make sure they're not going to hit any archaeological or historical resources. During their research and in that document, they stated that there was a cemetery that was there, but that all the bodies had been removed based on their historic research, and that there were no historic documents that were available to say who was buried in that cemetery. And there, I've seen those historic documents saying that people had been moved, but nowhere did it actually say the whole cemetery had been moved. So everybody many people involved in the project were surprised that they hit burials. But for those of us that live in Los Angeles and have ancestors that are buried in that cemetery, we knew that the cemetery was still there. And so there are stories of families who did, when the cemetery closed, did go in, remove their ancestors. Thinking about the Yoruba family, they actually removed their ancestors back to the Yoruba ranch in Orange County, and some other people removed their ancestors and took them to the old Calvary cemetery. But in no way were they going to empty the whole cemetery out. And so when we found out in January of 2011 that these ancestors were being uncovered, we knew that they were Native American ancestors because they were our family members. And in particular, they are also the descendants of the first settlers of Los Angeles. And in California, there's a law that if you hit human remains, you call the coroner. The coroner then decides whether it's an active murder case and or if they happen to be Native American remains. And so the coroner was called out when they first found those remains in October of 2010. And because it was within a known historical cemetery, he stated it wasn't a murder case and no longer under the purview of the county. And so then they just had to follow the typical public resource codes when you hit a historic cemetery. However, we knew that there were Native American remains in there. And if there's Native American remains, then the Native American Heritage Commission, which is a separate state entity in California, reaches out to the most likely descendant or the person who is probably most related to the Native American remains that are found. That process didn't happen because the coroner, under the law, stated it's a historical cemetery, it's not under my purview, and he never stated that they were Native American remains. At the time, they were little pieces of remains. So for 3 months, from October to January, they removed over 90 individuals, some in coffins, in deteriorated coffins, some, just laid out there, fragments, sometimes full skeletons, etc., never realizing or thinking about the Native American community would want to be involved. And so when we found this out from the student whistleblower, they then told their professor. The professor reached out to other local archaeologists, and local archaeologists then reached out to the Gabrielino Tongva community. And I wrote a call to arms on January 5th, 2011, and went out because every time we tried to call the county, call La Plaza, call anybody that we had contact with to say, those are Native American remains in there, we know they are, we got the runaround. So I really went in and tried to publicize that so that we could get it stopped. And a lot of it, when we talked to the CEO of La Plaza, Miguel Corzo, he kept saying, it's a historic cemetery, there are no Indians there. It's a historic cemetery, there are no Indians there. There are no records documenting that there are Indians there. And we held a vigil on January 9th, 2011, because they wouldn't allow us to see the ancestors. And at that time, we went next door to the parish office of La Plaza and said, where are the burial records for the cemetery that used to be here? And they're like, oh, they're at San Fernando Mission. And so then I and another Tongva cultural leader looked at each other. And, these are supposedly the documents that don't exist and they couldn't find. And all we had to do was go next door and ask where they are. And then I remembered the Huntington Library digitized all of the mission records back in 2006. And I go online and there are all the people's names of who were buried at La Plaza. And so I downloaded that information and provided it to the La Plaza leadership and said, here's all the burial records. And you'll see that a majority of the people listed here, it says Indio, 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 Indio. And it has the name of the villages that they're from. It has, if they happen to be Native people from outside of the state, it says what state they're from. How can you say that the people you're digging up are not Native people? And if anybody knows anything about the history of Los Angeles, you know that there was a lot of intermarriages and some, of course, forced conception because of rape between the settlers and the Indians. But the people that are in there are not only Indian, but in some instances are probably mixed because of those intimate relationships that occurred. So you can't just assume they're not Native and that they're just the settlers. And because of that, the Native community need to be involved to make sure that the ancestors are being treated correctly and sensitively, and that we tell you how we want them to be reburied.
Thank you once more for telling us and illustrating in again, a very vivid manner how your professional life intersects constantly with the personal. And the thing that really strikes me in this example of the construction of La Plaza in downtown Los Angeles is how law cannot help. It's there to protect history. It's there there are codes, right, that are in place in order to be able to contact the Native American Heritage Commission, but they fail because of a lack of documentation. And they fail because there is no paper trail or no documented or no connected paper trail, which you in fact were able to dig out. But there is ancestral memory. There is the oral memory, there is the ancestral memory, and then this memory is activated through community connections and community channels. So it is really, again, what I feel you have told us is the ways in which history and law law is supposed to protect history, but history and law do not intersect sometimes. And we need to learn ways in which to activate the ancestral memories, the oral memories, that do not or have not, because of what you told us previously, because they have been silenced, haven't entered documentation and haven't left quite the same paper trail that we are used to. So I really want to thank you for spending time with us today, telling us about these long effects of colonization and missionization. We will continue to pursue these topics at the Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. We are here on the native lands of the Tongva and Gabrielino community, and I want to acknowledge that today. And so CMRS is going to continue to be interested in questions of colonization of Indigenous California. Thank you, DESIREÉ Martinez, for your time. Thank you for sharing, and thank you to our listeners.